She loved to remind me of my age. A gentle, condescending smile would play on her lips as she'd say, "Oh, Susan, that's such a classic way of thinking. Or the world has changed, hasn't it?" She spoke of the future like a kingdom she had already conquered, while my opinions were quaint relics to be dusted off and politely ignored. My son Michael, his eyes clouded by infatuation, would chuckle nervously, a traitorous sound that stung more than her words. I stayed quiet, not from weakness, but from a deep, patient understanding they had yet to learn. Time doesn't just change the world. It exposes character better than any argument. When her relentless ambition, untempered by wisdom, began to crumble their world, costing them opportunities, friendships, and finally, their own stability. The woman who called me useless found herself desperately in need of the very thing she'd spent years mocking. But wisdom isn't a free gift you can demand in a crisis. And respect, once burned, must be painstakingly rebuilt. I didn't humiliate her with an "I told you so." I simply, quietly, allowed her to stand in the cold, stark landscape of her own consequences. And in that silence, she finally learned to listen. My name is Susan. For 35 years, I built a life of quiet substance. I wasn't a CEO or a mogul. I was the steady heartbeat of a home, the manager of a household that was also, in its way, a small, complex enterprise. My husband, Edward, and I ran a small but beloved independent bookstore. It was more than a shop. It was a community hub. We knew our customers, their children, their stories. We curated not just books, but connections. We weathered recessions, the rise of big box stores, and the first tremors of the digital age through adaptability, personal service, and an unwavering belief in the value of what we offered. Human touch in a transactional world. Edward passed away 5 years ago. The grief was a vast, quiet ocean. Our son Michael was my anchor. He was a kind-hearted, creative soul who had become a successful graphic designer. He was my pride and joy, but I always sensed a softness in him, a desire to please that made him vulnerable. Then he brought home Chloe. From the moment she stepped into my cozy, book-filled living room, I saw the calculation in her eyes. She was beautiful, sharp as a tack, with a career in high-stakes public relations. She spoke in a fluent stream of buzzwords: leverage, disruption, personal brand. She was impressive, and I wanted to be impressed. I wanted to love whoever Michael loved. I welcomed her. I cooked her favorite meals. I listened to her stories of navigating boardrooms and winning over clients. But slowly, the dismissals began. It was never overtly cruel. Chloe was too polished for that. It was a slow, steady erosion. If I mentioned how we'd handled a difficult supplier at the bookstore with patience and relationship building, she'd smile. "That's so sweet, Susan. Now we just use a performance-based contract and have an exit strategy." When I suggested a local, family-owned caterer for their wedding, she patted my hand. "It's okay to think small. But for our wedding, perception is everything. We've booked the plaza." Michael watched these exchanges, his smile strained. He'd try to bridge the gap. "Mom's got a point, Chloe, the family-owned place has amazing reviews." But he'd trail off under her cool, amused gaze. "Michael, darling," she'd say, "sentiment doesn't pay the mortgage." And he'd laugh, a hollow sound, and agree. The wedding was a spectacle of curated perfection. I felt like an extra in a film about someone else's life. After they returned from their honeymoon in Bali, the dynamic solidified. Chloe's mantra became their mantra. "Old ways hold you back," she'd declare. My bookstore, which I'd kept running in Edward's memory, was a nostalgia project. My advice was well-intentioned but out of touch. I was slowly being recategorized from mother and mother-in-law to a benign, slightly embarrassing artifact. The final, quiet insult was the smart home system they installed in the beautiful old Victorian they bought. Chloe presented it as a gift. So you don't have to worry about a thing when you visit, Susan. The lights, the heat, it's all automated. No more fumbling with switches. It was a perfectly packaged message. Your hands, your instincts are obsolete. The house itself would think for you. I smiled and thanked her. But inside, a quiet fortress was being built. Not of anger, but of observation. I saw her not as a villain, but as a case study in a particular, modern blindness. The confusion of speed for progress, of aggression for strength, of networking for community. She was building a life on the brittle ice of perception, and she didn't know winter was coming. My role, I decided, was not to warn her. Some lessons can only be taught by life itself. My role was to ensure I was not standing on the ice when it cracked. The trigger was the investor brunch. Chloe had been working tirelessly to land Michael a dream job. Creative director at a flashy, venture capital-backed tech startup called Nexus. The founder was a young, brash billionaire wunderkind Chloe had been cultivating for months. The final step was hosting an intimate, impeccable brunch for him and his wife at their home. Chloe commanded the preparation like a general. A Michelin-starred chef was hired. Flowers were flown in from Holland. The house was a stage set for success. I had offered to help. I could have baked, arranged flowers from my garden, anything. She'd laughed lightly. "Oh, Susan, that's so kind. But this has to be flawless. We've got professionals for all that." The message was clear. My homemade touch was a risk to their perfection. The day of the brunch, disaster struck in the form of a nor'easter. A sudden, violent storm slammed the city. Trees down power lines. At 10 a.m., as the chef was frantically trying to torch creme brulee with a butane lighter, the entire neighborhood went dark. The house, its smart systems utterly dependent on electricity, died. The automated blinds froze half open. The security system wailed a low battery alarm. The beautiful induction cooktop was a cold, black slab. Panic, pure, unvarnished panic on Chloe's face. The investor and his wife were due in an hour. This was the pitch of Michael's career. And it was unfolding in a dark, cold, beeping house. I lived 3 blocks away. My power was out too, but my house was different. It had a fireplace. It had a gas stove you could light with a match. It had candles, oil lamps, and a well-stocked pantry from a lifetime of believing in self-reliance. I had been quietly baking sourdough that morning. A habit Chloe found hilariously archaic. I walked to their house through the lashing rain, carrying a large basket. I didn't call. I just let myself in the old-fashioned way, with the key Michael had given me. I found Chloe in the pristine, dark kitchen, on the verge of tears, yelling at her unresponsive phone. Michael was uselessly flipping light switches. The chef was on the phone trying to find a generator. I didn't say a word. I set my basket on the counter. I took the beautiful, unsullied linen napkins and began to roll them with silverware. I produced a thermos of hot coffee from my basket, another of soup. I laid out the loaf of still warm sourdough, a wheel of cheese, a jar of my own preserves. I lit every candle I could find, transforming the dark, cold showroom into a place of warm, flickering, authentic hospitality. When the investor and his wife arrived, shivering and apologetic for the state of the world, they were ushered not into a scene of high-tech crisis, but into one of charming, resilient warmth. The CEO's wife's eyes lit up at the bread. "You made this?" she asked me. "It's incredible." The brunch proceeded. The conversation, instead of being a rehearsed pitch, became a real one. About weathering storms, about adaptability, about the value of things made by hand and sustained by care. Michael, relaxed by the genuine atmosphere, shone. He was creative, funny himself. After the guests left, immensely impressed, Chloe was euphoric. She turned to me, not with gratitude, but with a new, appraising look. "Well," she said, brushing a crumb from her designer dress, I guess even outdated skills have their moment. Like a lucky charm. Michael hugged me. Mom, you saved us. Chloe cut in, linking her arm with his. We saved it, Michael. We provided the platform. Susan just provided the props. That was the moment. The moment she took the lifeline I had thrown. The wisdom I had silently enacted. And dismissed it as a prop. A quaint bit of set dressing for her narrative of success. She looked at my hands, which had created warmth and sustenance from nothing, and still saw them as useless. The betrayal wasn't in her ingratitude. I expected none. It was in her fundamental, willful blindness. She had seen proof of a different kind of strength, a resilient, quiet power, and she had chosen to belittle it. The fortress of my observation solidified into granite. I would not lift a finger to save her again. The next storm would be hers to weather alone. In the months following the blackout brunch, Chloe's star, and by extension Michael's, seemed to rise. He got the Nexus job. Their social media was a glittering cascade of success. Luxury vacations, exclusive parties, Chloe photographed with influencers and minor celebrities. She had leveraged the charming Storm story into a narrative of their innovative, adaptable partnership. My role in it was erased from their official history. Her condescension towards me became more structural, less about opinions and more about my place in their new world. She and Michael bought a sleek, minimalist apartment in the city as a pied a terre. My Victorian guest room, she informed me, was being converted into a home gym. You understand, Susan. We need to optimize our space for our lifestyle. You're always welcome, of course, but the sofa in the media room pulls out. I was being professionally downsized from their lives. My weekly dinner invitations became monthly, then quarterly. When we did meet, the conversations were monologues about their ascendant world. Chloe spoke of cutting ties with energy vampires and curating their inner circle. I knew with a cold clarity that in her spreadsheets of social capital, I was a liability, a reminder of a slower, softer past she was aggressively overwriting. The first crack in her perfect facade appeared in her friendships. The high-powered, glossy friends she cultivated began to fall away. One, a woman named Jessica, showed up on my doorstep one afternoon distraught. She and Chloe had had a falling out over a business collaboration that went south. She threw me under the bus to save face with a client, Jessica wept. She told me loyalty was a poor investment. Susan, she's not who I thought she was. I made Jessica tea and listened. I didn't badmouth Chloe. I simply offered a quiet space, the same quiet I had offered the storm-darkened house. Jessica left, not with solutions, but with a measure of peace. I knew Chloe would frame this as me consorting with the enemy, but I no longer cared about her frames. Then Michael started to call me, late at night. His voice was strained. The Nexus job was a gilded cage. The work was soulless, the pressure immense. The Wunderkind CEO was erratic, cruel. Mom, he confessed once, voice thick. Chloe says I have to be tougher. That this is the price of winning. But it feels wrong. I didn't say, I told you so. I asked questions. What does your gut say, Michael? Not your wife, not your boss. You. It was a language he'd forgotten how to speak. The financial strain came next. To maintain the perception necessary for their lifestyle, they were living on a razor's edge. The mortgages, the car leases, the relentless social upkeep. Chloe's PR firm lost its two biggest clients in quick succession. Rumor had it her aggressive tactics had backfired. The glossy pictures continued, but the anxiety behind them was a scream I could hear through the phone lines. The final, definitive blow for me came during a rare family dinner at their city apartment. Chloe was holding court, discussing how they were going to pivot and monetize their personal brand. Michael looked exhausted. My grandson, little Leo, who was 4, was trying to show his mother a painting he'd made. Not now, Leo, she said absently, scrolling on her phone. Mommy's building our future. The child's face fell. He retreated to a corner. Without a word, I got up from the table, sat on the floor with him, and asked about his painting. It was a messy, wonderful splash of color. Tell me about the green part, I said. As he chattered, I looked over at the dining table. Chloe was oblivious, talking about market penetration. Michael was watching us, and in his eyes, I saw a longing so profound it broke my heart. He was watching the future he thought he wanted sell the present he actually needed, piece by piece. That night, I went home and cried. Not for myself, but for my son, and for the little boy on the floor. Chloe's pride wasn't just costing them money and friends, it was costing them their souls. And she was too busy giving the world a tour of her beautiful, empty house to notice it was on fire. The true turning point, the moment the passive observation turned into a strategic resolve, began with a cough. Little Leo developed a persistent, croupy cough that turned into pneumonia. He was hospitalized for 3 days. In the crisis, the brittle structure of their life shattered. Chloe's meticulously curated calendar meant nothing to a virus. The network of high-powered friends offered thoughts and prayers via text, but no one brought casseroles or sat vigil. The CEO of Nexus called Michael to complain about a missed deadline while his son was on oxygen. I was at the hospital every day. I brought real food for Michael, who wouldn't leave Leo's side. I sat and read to Leo when he was awake. I handled the practicalities Chloe's spreadsheet mind had no column for. Feeding the cat, watering the plants at the Victorian, dealing with the insurance calls that confused her with their bureaucratic, non-digital logic. One afternoon, I went to their city apartment to fetch some things for Michael. The place was a silent, cold monument to aspiration. On Chloe's pristine desk, amid the sleek tech, was an open notebook. I didn't mean to look, but a heading caught my eye. Contingency Plan Q4. It was a bullet point list. My breath caught. Michael's creative output declining. Emotional liability. Mother-in-law a persistent sentimental drain. Blocks necessary pragmatism. If Nexus position fails, leverage connections at Apex Corporation may require relocation SF. Reassess family unit viability if goals remain misaligned. The blood drained from my face. It was so cold, so clinical. My son was an emotional liability. I was a sentimental drain. Her own child's serious illness wasn't on the list. It was presumably just a logistical disruption. The word viability next to family unit made me feel sick. This was no longer just about disrespect toward me. This was a blueprint for discarding anything, anyone, that didn't serve her ambitions. She was running a corporation called My Life, and her husband and child were underperforming assets. I didn't confront her. That would have given her the emotional drama she could then use to paint me as the unstable one. Instead, I copied the page with my phone. I felt no guilt. This was no longer a private thought. It was a hostile action plan against my family. That night at the hospital, I found a moment alone with Michael. Leo was sleeping. Michael looked hollowed out. "How are you holding up, son?" I asked softly. He shook his head, tears in his eyes. "I don't know, Mom. Everything feels broken. The job, the money. Chloe is just so angry all the time. At me, at the situations. What do you want, Michael?" I asked the same question I'd asked before. Not what you're supposed to want. What does your heart want? He was silent for a long time, staring at his son's small hand in his. "I want to build things that mean something," he whispered. "Not just sell things. I want Leo to have a yard. I want to smell rain on grass, not exhaust. I want peace, Mom." It was the confession I'd been waiting for. The man was waking up inside the puppet she'd been operating. "That's a good want," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Remember it. The power didn't just shift, it crystallized. I was no longer just a disapproving mother-in-law. I was now the guardian of a truth. Her love was conditional, and her conditions were destroying my son. I had the evidence, not just of her contempt for me, but of her transactional view of the family itself. The quiet, useless woman now held the keys to the kingdom of reality, and I decided I would not use them to attack. I would use them to build a shelter for when her kingdom of ice inevitably felt. My plan was not an attack. It was a preparation. While Chloe scrambled to salvage her crumbling empire of perception, I began to quietly, methodically, build an article. Phase 1. The financial lifeline. I owned my home and the bookstore outright. Over decades, Edward and I had also built a modest but robust investment portfolio based on slow, steady growth, not speculation. I met with my financial advisor, a kind man named Martin who had worked with us for 30 years. I didn't tell him the whole story, just that I might need to provide a soft landing for my family in the near future. We restructured some assets to create a pool of accessible, liquid capital. It wasn't a fortune, but it was stability. It was a foundation made of brick, not Instagram-like. Phase 2. The safe haven. I began to make subtle changes to my home. I turned the dusty formal sitting room into a bright, inviting playroom for Leo, stocking it with classic books and simple, open-ended toys. The kind that spark imagination, not the branded, plastic noise. Stocking it with classic books and simple, open-ended toys. The kind that spark imagination, not the branded, plastic noise he was usually given. I made sure the guest room was always warm and ready. I was not preparing for a visit. I was preparing for a return. Phase 3. Rekindling the true Michael. I started sending my son links, not to articles about climbing corporate ladders, but to stories of small design studios doing meaningful work, of towns with strong communities, of studies on child development, and the importance of unstructured play. I'd tag him in social media posts about community gardens and local book fairs. When he called, stressed, I'd steer the conversation away from Nexus and Chloe's latest crisis, and ask him about a design project he'd loved in college, or remind him of the treehouse he and his father built. I was gently reminding him of his own blueprint, the one that existed before Chloe tried to overwrite it. Phase 4. Documenting the fall. I started a private, old-fashioned journal, not of my feelings but of facts, dates, times, quotes, the plummeting value of their speculative investments, gleaned from Michael's worried comments, the names of friends who had vanished, the specifics of Chloe's failed business deals, the page from her contingency plan. This was not for a lawsuit. It was for my son, for the day his confusion would crystallize into a need for clarity. It was a timeline of cause and effect, proving that the chaos wasn't bad luck, but the direct harvest of the seeds she had planted. I did all of this in utter silence. I attended the occasional strained family gathering and smiled politely. When Chloe made a snide remark about my quaint house or my retro lifestyle, I simply nodded and said, "It works for me." My calm was a wall her barbs could no longer pierce. They just clattered harmlessly to the ground. My quiet countermove was the opposite of hers. She was loudly building a tower, higher and more precarious. I was silently, deeply strengthening the ground. She thought I was standing still, being left behind. She didn't realize I was building the only thing that would be left standing when the high winds came. The collapse, when it came, was total. It didn't arrive with a single bang, but with a rapid, sickening series of crunch. First, Nexus imploded. The Wunderkind CEO was ousted in a scandal involving fraud. The company dissolved almost overnight. Michael was not just out of a job. His portfolio was tied to a name that was now toxic in the industry. Second, the financial house of cards folded. The mortgages on the two homes were based on projected earnings that no longer existed. the luxury car leases, the astronomical credit card debt accrued for networking and image. The collection calls began. Third, and most devastatingly for Chloe, her social capital evaporated. In her world, failure was contagious. The invitations stopped. The power couples ghosted her. Her own small firm collapsed, as clients feared association with someone whose personal brand was now wife of a failed tech executives. The strain exploded their marriage. The fights were epic, heard through the phone when Michael called me weeping. She blamed him for not being tougher, smarter, more resilient. He blamed her for pushing him into a gilded cage, and then locking the door. The climax occurred on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Michael showed up at my doorstep, Leo in his arms, a single duffel bag at his feet. The climax occurred on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Michael showed up at my doorstep, Leo in his arms, a single duffel bag at his feet. He looked like a survivor of a shipwreck. His eyes were red, his face gain. She asked us to leave, he said, his voice flat. She said we were dragging her down. That she needed to reset, and couldn't do it with emotional dead weight. She used those words, Mom. About me. About her son. I didn't say a word. I opened my arms. I took Leo, who clung to me, confused and quiet. I led my son inside, to the warm, lamplit kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and bread. I sat him down and made tea. An hour later, the doorbell rang. It was Chloe. The polished veneer was gone. Her hair was frizzed from the rain, her makeup streaked. She looked young, frightened, and utterly lost. She wasn't here to fight. She was here because the tower had fallen, and she had nowhere else to go. She stepped into the foyer, her eyes avoiding mine, landing on Michael in the kitchen. Michael, she said, her voice uncharacteristically small. We need to talk. We need to figure this out. Michael didn't get up. He looked at her, and for the first time, I saw not love or pain in his eyes, but a clear, weary recognition. Figure what out, Chloe? The exit strategy? The liability mitigations? She flinched. Don't be like that. This is a crisis. We need to be pragmatic, he repeated, the word tasting like ash. Like in your contingency plan? Where I'm an emotional liability, and Leo and my mom are sentimental drains. Her face went white. She hadn't known he'd seen it. She looked at me, and a flash of the old fury returned. You showed him. I did, I said calmly, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Because he had a right to know what pragmatic looked like to you. It looks like a spreadsheet where your family is line items. She spluttered, trying to regain the upper hand, to spin it. That was just business planning. Stress thinking. You wouldn't understand the pressure. I understand that when the storm hit. I interrupted, my voice still quiet but filling the space. You had a smart home that went dark and a caterer who left. I had a match for the stove, flour for bread, and a home that was a shelter, not a showcase. You called my skills useless. But today, it's my useless skills that are giving your husband and your son a warm room, hot food, and a place where they are loved, not assessed for viability. The truth of it hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. She had nothing. No retort, no spin, no PR solution for this. She had built her life on being right, on being the smartest in the room. And now, in the room that mattered most, she was profoundly, utterly wrong. She looked from my steady gaze to Michael's resigned one, to Leo peeking out from behind my leg. The reality of her isolation, the true cost of her pride, crashed down upon her. Her shoulders slumped. The fight left her. She wasn't a conqueror anymore. She was just a woman in the rain, standing on the doorstep of the wisdom she had spent years mocking, finally understanding its price. What do I do? She whispered, the question not directed at anyone, a plea to the universe. I didn't offer her a solution. I offered her the consequence. You live with what you've built, Chloe, I said softly. You can start by leaving this house. This is their shelter tonight. You need to find your own. I closed the door. Not with a slam, but with a firm, gentle finality. The sound was not of vengeance, but of a boundary, long overdue, finally being set. The power in that moment was not in triumph, but in profound, peaceful sovereignty. She had called me useless. Life had just proven her devastatingly wrong. And the proof was in the quiet safety of the home she had scorned, and in the shattered reflection of herself she saw in the rain-streaked glass as she walked away. That was 18 months ago. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. It was messy financially, but clean emotionally for Michael. He gave her what she wanted most: a clean break, most of the remaining assets to settle the debts she was frantic about, and sole custody of Leo, which she did not contest. Her pragmatism, extended to understanding a child, was a hindrance to the radical reboot she desired. Michael and Leo live with me. The guest room is now permanently theirs. Michael took the lifeline capital I'd set aside, and combined with a small business loan, bought a partnership in a small, respected local design firm. They work with nonprofits, small businesses, and artists. He comes home tired, but with light in his eyes. He is building things that mean something. Leo thrives. He has a yard. He helps me in the kitchen, his hands covered in flour. He has a grandfather in Martin, my financial advisor, who takes him fishing. The playroom is constantly in a state of joyful change. Chloe moved to the West Coast for her reset. We hear snippets through mutual acquaintances. She's working for a large corporate firm, climbing again, but the glitter seems gone. She sends Leo extravagant gifts on his birthday and Christmas, but calls are rare and stilted. I think she cannot bear the living proof of the life she discarded. A life that in my quiet, useless house, is now full of messy, resilient job. As for me, I still run the bookstore. It's had a resurgence as people crave real connection. Young people like Michael's new partner, a warm-hearted teacher named Anna, tell me it's their sanctuary. I've even started a weekly storytelling hour for children. Leo is my star help. This real-life story taught me that the loudest voice in the room is often the most fragile. True strength isn't declared. It's demonstrated in quiet consistency, in the ability to keep a flame burning in a storm. I learned that you cannot argue someone into valuing you. You can only live your values so clearly that when their world dims, your steady light is the only one they can see by. And by then, it may be too late for them to share its warmth. The greatest revenge is not schadenfreude. It is apathy toward the opinions of those who never understood you, and profound gratitude for the peace that comes when you stop trying to prove your worth to the blind. Chloe mistook my silence for weakness, my practicality for irrelevance. She didn't understand that I was not on her battlefield. I was tending my garden. And now, while she wanders in a desert of her own making, we are here, harvesting the fruits of a different kind of labor. Love, patience, and the quiet, unshakable power of a home built on a solid foundation. They called me outdated. But some things are timeless. The strength of a quiet spirit, the warmth of a welcoming home, and the enduring truth that while pride builds towers, it is humility that builds shelters. And in the end, we all need a place to come in from the rain. If this emotional story about quiet strength, family, and the real meaning of value has resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and reflections are what make this community. For more calm, reflective real-life stories about navigating difficult relationships and finding your own peace, please like and subscribe. Thank you for listening.